thank you for the invitation. I'm delighted to be here with you. I look forward to learning from you. It's my first trip to Israel. I hope it's not my last. I look forward to learning more about the Israel education system. So as you've seen the book that Mike has held up, one thing I wanted to mention going forward, there are 25 chapters, I believe, in this volume. Along with an introductory chapter, there are 24 substantive chapters. Of those 24, only one attempts to provide causal evidence. The other 23 provide descriptive evidence, try to lay out what really are important patterns that are part of what one needs to know to understand relationships between growing income inequality on the one hand in the United States and educational opportunities for low-income children on the other hand. And the reason I mention that is, as those of you who do quantitative research know, being able to make credible causal claims is very challenging. And so almost all of the evidence here is purely descriptive. It is based on a variety of data sets, which I'll describe a bit. And because I realize a relevant question is what are the available data sources from which one could learn about these issues or related issues in Israel. I would welcome questions along the way. I think that's much more interesting. With the one caveat that if it gets to be that I've used up all but 3 minutes of my time and I'm only on the second slide, that maybe at that point you could allow me to rush quickly through the other slides. But I think the questions are really interesting back and forth. I think so I would ask you to interrupt me with questions and comments. So what this graph attempts to show is what's happened to the distribution of income over the last 40 years for America's children. And thinking of 1970 as the starting point, then look at what's happened to the real income of children that are in families at the 20th percentile, meaning 20% of children live in families with less money, 80% live in families with more money, and you can see there's been a quite remarkable decline of more than 25%. On the other hand, if you look at families in the 80th percentile, there's been a quite substantial increase, and if you look at children in families that are in the 95th percentile, there's been even greater growth. Now, what's really quite striking is that if you made this same graph between the period 1945 and the late 1970s, the curves would be right on top of each other. Basically, that was a 3-decade period in which it was the case that economic growth was a boat that was a rising tide in which all benefited. In the last 30 years, and 40 years, it's been really quite strikingly different. So this is the same evidence displayed very differently. Some people like one graph, some people like the other. These are the real incomes. In each set of bars, the far left bar is the 20th percentile income. So comparing the left bar in each set, you can see that real income in 2012 dollars for children in families at the 20th percentile income declined from about $38,000 expressed in 2012 dollars down to $27,000. Quite a precipitous decline, and in contrast, the situation at the 80th and 95th. Now these data, these graphs are based upon U.S. Census data, current population survey, administered to something less than 100,000 families every month in the United States. And I presume you have an analogous household survey in Israel. Of course, I don't know that. Now, what's happened to children's distribution of children's achievement over those late periods? This is from one of the chapters in With or Opportunity by Sue Donarski and Martha Bailey. And basically, these are based on two longitudinal data sets. They had two cohorts of the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth. In the first cohort on the left-hand side are for individuals who, a nationally representative sample of individuals who were teenagers, 14 years old, in the mid-1970s. And of those, children whose families were in the top quarter of the income distribution, 36% of them had graduated from a four-year college by the age of 25. In contrast, those from the bottom quarter, only 5% had graduated. Now move 20 years later to young people who were a second cohort, who were 14 years old in the mid-1990s, and ask what happened to them going forward. And we see that it is now the case that 54% of those children from top income families graduated from college, an 18 percentage point increase versus only 4% increase for children from bottom income families. And this was happening during a period in which the economic payoff to college increased quite dramatically during the 1980s, and the percentage differential in labor market earnings between four-year college graduates and high school graduates has stayed remarkably high over the past 2 decades. Now, my understanding is that the situation in Israel is somewhat different from that, and I look forward to learning more about that today. So here we see again, during the same time period in which family income inequality grew markedly, we also see the inequality in educational attainments between children from affluent and low-income families increasing markedly. And given these attainments have become more unequal, it's not surprising that skill measures have become more unequal as well. This is work that's gotten a lot of attention by Sean Reardon, a very good sociologist at Stanford, that again, he did this work initially for the With or Opportunity Project. And the upward sloping curve shows the gap is measured on kind of an SAT scale in which 100 points is roughly a standard deviation. So in 1970, children at the 90th percentile had math and reading scores that were about 0.8 standard deviations above the average reading and math scores of children at the 10th percentile. By the year 2008, that gap between test scores of children at the 90th percentile versus the 10th percentile had increased by about 50%. So just a marked increase. And what is quite striking and surprising is that happened during an extended period in which the gap in test scores between black children and white children declined quite markedly. So this is quite striking. Now this is based upon 14 different data sets. It's quite a remarkable accomplishment. Some of them are national educational progress data sets, some of them are longitudinal studies. There is, all of the chapters in With or Opportunity have detailed appendices, and Sean's is one of the longest, that describes exactly what data were used and how the data were analyzed. And they're available online at the Russell Sage Foundation website. So we see it's contemporaneous, an increase in family income inequality and an increase in inequality in educational attainment and skill levels. So of course, are these causally related? Now that's a very hard question to answer. What Greg Duncan and I did is we had a simple conceptual model to organize thinking about this and organize the evidence about this. And basically the model is that that income inequality impacts on children's educational opportunities and educational attainment through two sets of mechanisms. One having to do directly with families and one having to do directly with schools. And a lot of the papers in the volume provide descriptive evidence on the roles of families and the roles of schools. Okay. So looking at the role of families, as we thought about it, we see two sets of mechanisms through which families matter. One is families that have more money, have more financial resources to spend on their children. And they also have more capacity to deal with the stress that is involved in raising children, surviving their teenage years, such things. So what's one example of this? So look at this comes from the volume, and this is evidence based on a consumer expenditures survey, which is a Department of Commerce data set, a federal government data set. And basically what in the left-hand set of bars, this is estimates of the amount of money families in different parts of the income distribution spent on enrichment for their children. So we see in the early 1970s, there is a gap of about $2,500 between what affluent families, top 20%, and low-income families, bottom 20%, spent. But look at what happened 30 years later. That gap is just exploded. And so basically the story here is that, and I think what our hypothesis to understand this is that all families do their best to take care of their children. But one of the things that families observed, particularly those who were well enough educated to understand what was happening in labor markets, is that the educational attainments were much more important predictors of labor market success in the late 1980s and in the subsequent 2 decades than they were in the late 1970s. So consequently, if one's trying to take care of one's family, being sure that a child gets the best education possible is a very good way to try and provide advantages to your children. And parents with financial resources did just that. They invested in tutors, in summer camps, in foreign travel, a whole variety of things, and you see that in these numbers that low-income families, low-income parents could not do. Please.
Sorry. Do you know that these are things that are in addition to parents' time, or does it replace parents' time?
Thank you. There is a very nice chapter by Meredith Phillips that shows does not have the longitudinal dimension because of limitations in the data. But what she does do is look at the panel study of income dynamics, of which my co-director Greg Duncan is the world's expert, has a time use supplement that was administered in about 2002, I believe. And Meredith analyzed that to look at how families spend their time. And one of the striking things, if I remember right, is that high there were big differences between the amount of time spent on literacy activities, higher in high-income families than in low-income families, and one staggeringly large difference in amount of time spent in novel places, vacations and things, between affluent families and low-income families. So there were very big time differences favoring affluent families. Okay. And again, it would have been wonderful to have being able to have that information for 2 cohorts rather than 1. That wasn't possible at that time. I've actually got somebody working on this now because there is another data set which you'll see in a minute, an example of the educational ECLS, Early Childhood Longitudinal Survey, that provided information on time use for young children who were of kindergarten age in the late 1990s. They've redone that a decade later, and that information is supposed to be released in a few months that will provide the capacity to see whether time use, the distribution of time use between low-income and high-income families has changed over the last decade. So again, we see it's not only money directly in things you can buy, but it's also in dealing with stress. As some of you know, the evidence from neuroscience is growing markedly concerning the effect of what some neuroscience call toxic stress particularly during the very early years of life when brains are being formed, and the effect of that on how brains are wired are very long-lasting. And there's a very nice chapter in the volume by an eminent neuroscientist, Charles Nelson, and a colleague that describes what we've learned from neuroscience that is relevant to understanding why growing up in a very low-income family typically leads to quite poor educational outcomes. So how about schools? So this is the dimension of our school model. And basically, the way we've conceived it, which is fairly simple, is to say the way that growth in income inequality resulted in a growth in the gaps in the quality of schooling received by children from affluent families and those from lower income families comes through the mechanism of increased residential segregation by income. So Sean Reardon, the same sociologist we saw before, has a very nice paper in the American Journal of Sociology, the America's leading sociology journal, in which he documents with a colleague that residential segregation by income, not by race, but by income, increased markedly during the 1980s and to a lesser extent during the 1990s. So basically, very affluent families chose increasingly to live in neighborhoods surrounded by other affluent families, and low-income families tended to live increasingly in neighborhoods surrounded by other low-income families. Now, the reason that affects schooling is it's still the case that most American children go to school close to where they live. So there's evidence in the volume by 2 economists showing that schools have become more segregated by income. Low-income children are more likely than was the case 40 years ago to attend schools in which their classmates are low income. And on the other hand, affluent children are more likely to go to school attend a school in which their classmates are relatively high income. Well, why does this matter? Well, there's evidence in the volume that it affects that affects quality of education through three mechanisms: peer behavior, student turnover, and teacher quality. So the story on peer behavior is, if you ask any educator in the United States about their experiences from year to year, and they will almost always tell you about the year in which they had these two children in that class that took all their time, thereby dramatically reducing the amount of time they had for instruction. Those two troublesome children are almost always boys, and typically, and there is increasing evidence to support that having emotionally disturbed children in class, or children who are just problematic because they have very low achievement, leads to lower achievement for their classmates. So as you see here, this is evidence that from the volume, Greg Duncan and Catherine Magnuson, and this comes from this early childhood longitudinal survey, which is a large longitudinal study, nationally representative study of children who were entering kindergarten in the late 1990s. And these are reports of teachers. So the yellow bars are teachers' reports about the students in their classes in schools in which fewer than 5% came from low-income families. The white bars are teachers' reports of student composition in schools in which at least 50% of children came from low-income families. And not surprising, you see that the schools, the high-poverty schools, the white bars, have teachers who report that a much larger percentage of their students have achievement problems, attention problems, and behavior problems. And there is increasingly good causal evidence that being in a classroom in which children have those problems results in lower achievement for their classmates. So one mechanism comes directly through these peer group effects. Could I just get some, something to drink? So a second mechanism, a student turnover. There's a very nice paper in the volume by Steve Raudenbush, and this is based upon data from Chicago that was, thank you very much. This is based on data that provided by the City of Chicago's Department of Education that allowed Steve and his colleagues to examine how much student turnover takes place during a school year. Basically, how many children enter a class after the school year has started. This is the one paper that is causal in the volume. And then examines, well, does it make any difference to children's achievement if children are entering during the school year? And what Raudenbush and his colleagues find, based on Chicago data, is first of all, it's in schools serving high percentages of poor children that student turnover is the highest. Families lose housing, children have to move, families move, you have new children entering. Then the research also shows that being in a class in which there is significant student turnover results in lower mathematics achievement growth, not only for the children who move, but also for the children who stay in the same class all year. And again, that won't surprise any teacher. Basically, if you have to deal with a new child entering the class every few weeks, it takes a great deal of time to integrate that child into the class, and that's time taken away from instruction. And the third mechanism is teacher quality. One of the very disturbing patterns that's very well documented in the United States is that schools serving children most in need of the nation's best teachers are the least likely to get them. A very troubling pattern. Okay.
Is Teach for America any factor in this, that the student numbers enter at all, the large scale?
Well, Teach for America, as you know, Avital, has grown in number of teachers enormously, but it still is tiny. The United States has 3.5 million teachers. The number of Teach for America participants is still very modest relative to that. They do work, as you know, in Teach for America participants in very high poverty schools, and that's a good thing, but they typically only stay 2 years. And one of the striking patterns is that our teachers get a lot better after they've at least a couple of years of experience. So they're very smart. I think the program does try and do this quite intensive training over the summer. But even the Teach for America graduates have a lot to learn when they're entering these high poverty schools. So basically, these are the school mechanisms through which increases in income inequality impacted on educational opportunities for low-income children. Well, what's the intergenerational story here? This is, again, by Mike Hout, a sociologist at Berkeley in the volume. And he uses data from the General Social Survey. And that's a survey administered every year, I believe, by the University of Michigan to several thousand American adults, basically asking about their educational attainment and those of their parents, interestingly enough. So basically what you see here, this is for males, is that the percentage of American males who by the age of 25 had more education than their fathers grew enormously between 1930 and 1960, continued very high, but notice since about 1975 has declined. In contrast, if you look at the percentage of males who by age 25 completed less education than their fathers, that in fact has grown. So this is a really very troubling phenomenon, because particularly given what's happened to education-related wage differentials in the United States, they've grown enormously, stayed very high. Getting a good education, completing college, is really the only path to upward socioeconomic mobility. And this isn't happening for a great many low-income children. This is from a paper by Marcus Yanti, a Scandinavian economist. Most Americans will say, yes, we have great income inequality, but we have extraordinary intergenerational mobility. Most Americans are very surprised when they learn that intergenerational socioeconomic mobility is lower in the United States in recent years than in a number of other countries for which there are good data. Okay. So how do you deal with this? This is our second book that will be out next month. We have, and basically what we argue, and again, I think that there are clearly normative elements in this argument as well as positive evidence. We argue that basically reducing income inequality, increases in income inequality may be the root cause of these growing gaps in educational outcomes. But even if we were possible to reduce income inequality, which the political forces are clearly aligned very much to the contrary, it's not obvious that that per se would lead to better education for poor kids. But more importantly, that's probably, at least in the foreseeable future, unfortunately, highly unlikely politically. If we could reduce residential segregation by income, that would be good. But it's very hard to see any policies contribute to that. So when we look for what are possible opportunities, and we basically suggest that there are really three mechanisms. One is increasing economic support for low-income families. The evidence on the value of that is quite striking. There is quite compelling causal evidence that providing low-income families with financial support increases the achievement of their young children. Giving the evidence comes on the first point, for example, from expansions of the earned income tax credit. And basically, when families have more money, does this impact positively on outcomes for their kids? And the answer is, for young children of primary elementary school age, it does. And the second, not surprisingly, is that we've emphasized in our volume, is that effective early childhood programs are critically important, as are making schools more, improving the schools which low-income children attend. So I think the case for better family support is self-evident. I think the causal evidence is increasingly good, and giving the increasing peer group evidence, having more children come to school not hungry, being healthy, being ready to learn, is clearly an important way to improve educational outcomes, not only for them, but for their classmates. What we did in our new book, Greg and I, is we knew we wanted to have a chapter on early childhood, which is really Greg's specialty, and we knew the evidence that early childhood investments seemed very promising. And I was delighted to learn in the last couple of days about the initiative in Israel to have universal preschool education for 3-year-olds as well as 4-year-olds. And of course, the challenge will be to make that high quality. So we wanted to find interventions, early childhood, elementary school, high school, and family supports that satisfied 3 criteria. First of all, they were conducted at some scale. They weren't one school, one program. Second, they were evaluated using cutting-edge methods that my economist colleagues would find compelling. And third, that they showed that these interventions improved outcomes for low-income children. And what we did is highlight those interventions in our book. We will have 3 5-minute videos with the support of the Spencer Foundation available by the end of January that describes these videos, I think, in rich, interesting ways. So what are the characteristics of these school interventions? First of all, in all of them, they developed a coherent, systematic plan of improvement, and they stuck with it for an extended period of time. Second is they all provided the individual schools with very strong school supports of a variety of kinds, and they combined that with what we call sensible accountability. And the reason we believe that combination is important is that the tendency in the United States to do accountability without supports does not have a good track record at all. If you put people under enormous pressure to do things they do not know how to do, you should not be surprised when you get very dysfunctional responses. On the other hand, simply providing resources without pressure for people to change typically doesn't lead to good outcomes either, because all of us are set in our ways to some extent, and change is difficult to bring about. So that combination is critical. And then all of the interventions we highlight, there is this combination of consistent school supports and sensible accountability. But then, of course, the question is, unfortunately, these interventions that we highlight, while some of them are of significant scale, like the Boston pre-K program is in 75 schools, they are still very much the exceptions. Low-income children, it's only a very small minority of low-income children that get the kind of preschool elementary school and high school programs that we describe. And why is that? Well, there are many characteristics of American education, and these are some of them, that make it very difficult to provide consistently this combination of compelling, consistent school supports and sensible accountability. So we try and end on a cautious but guardedly optimistic approach, and basically argue that there are strengths of America to build upon, just as there are strengths in Israel to build upon. They would be very different strengths, I believe, but there are strengths to build upon in the United States, and we think it is possible to do a better job in educating low-income children. And just to conclude, and I'm just 3 slides away from the end, Michael, if one looked for evidence of, this goes beyond Wither Opportunity, this is a project I've been working on for about 10 years with data from Massachusetts. Now, Massachusetts, which is the state in which I live, which is, its population is not as large as Israel's, but the same order of magnitude. And it's not a typical state. It's the state that has the highest educational attainment of adults, second highest income. So, but nonetheless, it is a state that has had very large gaps in educational attainments and achievement between low-income children and high-income children. In 1993, the state legislature passed comprehensive school reform legislation that involved developing quite high academic standards. They're thought to be about the best in the country as rated by different groups, both union groups and management groups. They put a lot more money, state money, into education, and they developed a quite comprehensive approach to trying to improve schools. And there's evidence that it's made a difference. So this is the, these are, Massachusetts has an exit exam that's administered to 10th graders in both reading and mathematics that children need to pass in order to graduate. So this is the passing rate of children when they take this in 10th grade. And basically what you see is that low-income children, and that's about 1.3 times the poverty line, so that's a family income of about $30,000 or less, that in 2003, go ahead. Okay, let me finish the sentence, and then, so basically when these exams were first introduced with stakes, meaning you couldn't graduate if you didn't pass them, there was a very large gap in the passing rate of higher income children versus lower income children. Notice it looks like the passing rate on both exams of low income children was less than 0.6. So 2 out of 5 were not passing in 2003. So over the subsequent decade, passing rates for both low income and high income children have increased. But notice the rate of increase is higher among low-income children. So there has been progress in closing these gaps. Let me show you one more picture. And these are high school graduation rates. This is the gap in high school graduation rates between low-income and higher-income students. There are 3 lines because the top line is the gap in the graduation rate within 4 years of entering high school. The bottom line is the gap when you give kids 6 years to complete. And the reason that gap is smaller is that a lot of low-income children take more than 4 years to graduate from high school. But no matter whether you look at 4-year graduation rate, 5-year, or 6-year, the gap between low-income children and high-income children has declined. There's still clearly a great deal of work to do, But I take this as significant evidence that developing a coherent, comprehensive plan that includes both accountability and an attempt to really provide more technical assistance and resources to schools has made a difference over 20 years. So, of course, this is the last substantive slide, I believe. Oh, excuse me. Thank you very much. Thank you.
This is very impressive. Can you say a few words about what you mean by a comprehensive approach to school improvement?
So first of all, they developed quite specific academic standards in core subjects tied to specific grade levels on what children should learn at each grade level. Now, I don't know, most countries have had such standards for a long time. In the United States, there are no national standards, and states only in the late 1980s began to develop them, and in many states, they're a mile wide and an inch deep. The Massachusetts standards are thought to be quite parsimonious and thoughtful. They spent a lot of money on developing new assessments that children take in grades 3 through 8 and grade 10 that are closely aligned. For example, there is a writing assessment in every grade. Now, that may seem like a modest thing, but the effect in Boston, where I've spent a lot of time in public schools, the impact on the amount of time and effort teachers spend in helping children to learn to write is just quite striking. Then the question is, how do you develop then improving the teaching force? They increased the standards to become a teacher quite substantially. They provided significant funds to support the development of teachers. They provided funds to support kids who were not doing well. So these are some of the dimensions. And they have working towards what you already have, which is early childhood programs. They do not have these throughout the state. They need to have them. So those are some of the dimensions.
Thank you.
So, yes, thank you.
I would like to know if you could say a little more on this EITC research that shows that low-income families spend more on education or improve the situation of their children's achievements, because this is a question. We have a sort of a very small EITC in Israel, and we believe it's a good thing to double it or triple it. It costs, of course, money, but that sounds very interesting. And fits also with some evidence of unconditional cash payments, which was published just a little time ago from the US also, Columbia University, that showed that it's a very good thing.
You can. Can I try and respond to this much? Because my mental capacity is limited to one ability to remember one question at a time, but I will come to you next. Yes, the evidence is, I think, quite good in a causal fashion, but it is black box evidence. You know, these are natural experiments. The exogenous variation comes from expansions in the earned income tax credit that affected some groups and not other groups. The paper is Dahl, and I forgot the co-author. It's in the American Economic Review in 2012. It's also, all of this evidence is described in some detail in chapter 3 of our new book, Restoring Opportunity, that'll be available on, there's an ebook version, in fact, that'll be available in a month.
I'd like to ask, how do charter schools fit into restoring opportunity?
It's a terrific question, and we actually do try and deal with that in our new book in some detail. the elementary schools that we highlight as successful interventions, which come from the south side of Chicago, are charter schools. So we do, you know, charter schools are public schools. They're public schools. If they have excess demand, they have to use a lottery to determine who gets in. They're freed from some of the regulations. We see the evidence on charter schools as by no means compelling. The evidence, such as it is that the distribution of achievement of charter schools looks pretty much like the distribution of achievement for high poverty traditional public schools. Some are quite good, like the ones we highlight. Others are not. Now, one of the things that I think is an interesting pattern in charter schools is that the percentage of charter schools that, instead of trying to act independently, instead are part of what are called charter management organizations, has increased substantially. They are networks that are trying to support groups of charter schools. They're trying to provide these combination of consistent school supports and sensible accountability that, of course, traditional school districts, that's their job, but they've had a great deal of trouble in doing. So I think the big question is, will these CMOs, charter management organizations, be able to be a source of this combination? And I think the jury is very much still out on those. One of the things on charter schools is you need to look at them for an extended period of time, in the sense that a lot of the charter schools rely on very young people who they ask to work, to carry a beeper, to answer the phone to children's questions at 11 o'clock at night, 2 in the morning. And what they found is they work pretty well for a couple of years, but then they burn out teachers and school leaders. So as a strategy for serving large numbers of low-income children, I think that model is very limited. Okay, this is my last slide. So, I mean, basically, I think, the challenge is just enormous to improve education. I think if we don't do that in the United States, the impact on upward mobility will be really quite substantial. And since Greg and I think this social mobility is a lot of the glue that has held the country together, that's a very troubling pattern. Now, to do this, we need this combination of strong school supports and accountability. One of the real difficulties in the United States is a tendency to do the accountability quickly, but lag on the school supports. And I think that would be, I think we already know from No Child Left Behind that that is not an effective strategy. So you might ask then, how will we know if we're making progress in the United States towards providing a better education in high poverty schools? Well, one, I think, simple litmus test that you're going to see long before you see better test scores or higher educational attainments is simply, are those schools where talented educators want to work? In most cases now, the answer is no. A necessary condition for success is that the answer has to be yes. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Dick, don't sit down yet, because Mike has agreed that if there are 1 or 2 more questions, we can tag them on now. I don't want to interrupt the flow here. This was so interesting and rich. So if there's another question or 2, so I'll yield to Moshe Yustman. Put your microphone on, Moshe.
Can you say something about the role that unions have played, teachers' unions have played in this? I think it varies enormously and is changing.
The history of teacher unionism in the United States, I think you need to look in very long perspectives. They really came into power, although some of them are very old, but they came into having power after World War II, when before that, what teachers were paid depended pretty much on what gender they were, and there was lots of favoritism and cronyism. In an attempt to professionalize teaching, unions played a role in working with managers to develop uniform salary scales. But over time, the contracts became longer and longer. And during the 1970s, for example, there were things put in play like teachers have the right to transfer, if they have enough seniority, to any school they want to teach at. When that was put in place in the 1970s, it seemed like effectively a costless perquisite to offer teachers, because there was a teacher shortage at the time, so there were plenty of openings. Well, that has turned out to be a disaster, in the sense that it's effectively been the path through which teachers with experience move to schools serving middle-class kids, leaving schools with poor kids staffed by very novice teachers. So I think that's increasingly recognized. Bringing about change has been tough. It's varied very much from school district to school district, depending on the quality of the union leadership and the quality of management in negotiating. But I think, so it's very tough, and you can tell by the tone, I don't think saying unions are the problem. If we ended unions, we'd have better schools. I don't think that's right, but I also don't think it's right to say that the interests of teacher unions are coincident with the interests of poor children. I don't think that's right either. So change has been tough. Some of the more interesting charter schools are the Green Dot schools that in fact are union-led. So it's a time of significant change. Who would have thought you would have teacher evaluations mandated to all of the 30-odd states that have raced to the top money now? It's a really changing world. Now, whether it will be changed for the better, I think still remains to be seen.
Okay, one more or two more. All right, Rami and Noah.
You started out with pointing out the root cause of inequality, and with the assumption of the inability of really changing that. And I wonder how you see growing inequality affecting the ability to get the political system to actually invest the kind of money in the classes that are not of interest to a lot of the wealthier people. So I wonder how you see this relationship working out. Wouldn't that be the case where you want reduction of taxes if you're high income, and you want other things, and not necessarily investing in schools to that extent?
Of course. I mean, you're absolutely right. There's a thoughtful book by two political scientists a couple years ago that makes just that case, basically that the very wealthy have bought the Congress, is the argument. And there's no question there is a lot to that. Surely you see it in attempts to bring about tax reform. I mean, it's just hard to believe that this carried interest dimension, that people, the hedge fund managers pay 15% tax on their multi-million-dollar earnings, while the rest of upper middle families that have two teachers as parents are paying as much as 38% tax rate. I mean, this is clearly the political power. I guess our judgment was that there are more affluent people who at least are receptive to the argument we ought to improve educational opportunity for poor kids than they are to, even if it costs some money, than they are to some of the other things that would such as tax reform. But I realize that's a very tough.
Last question, Rami.
Thank you so much. I'm just wondering whether you can say something about the role of educational disparity in the home, not something that you talk about money giving out, but what the child gets at home. What is the impact of that on inequality outside of
The evidence on that, of course, is enormously striking. Some of you may know the Hart and Risley study from the 1970s, where Hart and Risley were two developmentalists who had resource assistants in the homes of a large sample of children for an extended period of time, counting words that were said. And they found that the gap in the number of words that low-income children hear versus upper-income children was just staggering. And you see that the work that Greg and this Catherine Magnuson have done that looks at gaps in literacy and knowledge of words at the age children are entering kindergarten. It's just absolutely extraordinary. And one of the new findings about the importance of this that I find striking is, you know, the focus under the Bush administration of the so-called Reading First program was on emphasis on phonics to teach kids to be able to basically read simple fictional passages. Phonics are a good thing, there's no question. And in fact, the test scores of low-income children on third grade tests did increase, but they did not increase in later grades. And the reason is that the nature of reading changes, beginning about fourth grade, from learning to read to reading to learn. So instead of reading simple fictional passages, which tends to be the focus on the third grade tests, children are then increasingly asked to read social and science studies texts. And there, phonics aren't enough, because you may be able to sound out the word hippopotamus. You know, that's a purely phonetic word. But if you've never heard that word before, what do you do? So basically, these differences in vocabulary, background knowledge, simple, for example, those have turned just increasingly important. And that's why the preschool program we highlight in our book that for 4-year-olds has a very interesting strategy to help kids learn some of this vocabulary and background knowledge. But there's no difference, no question. There are enormous differences. You see it not only in money, you see it in time use, you see it in parenting style. The evidence, unfortunately, in the US context of attempts to teach parenting skills is not the evidence is not encouraging, unfortunately.
Dick, thank you very much.